Welcome back. We are going to pick up with the three categories of age-related change. So the first one is shared age-graded changes. There we go. So one type of a shared age-graded change would be the kinds of outcomes that are governed by the biological clock. So this would really be the nature side. Your genes probably govern your biological clock. There's probably some amount of influence from the environment, but a lot of it is going to be governed by the genes, right? So all of us at approximately the same age learn to sit up unassisted. Now, it could vary by a few weeks this way or that way. And if our parents were feeling competitive with their peers who had a same age baby, they might have been, oh, my baby's behind or my baby's ahead or whatever. But honestly, we were within a month of each other. And in this big scheme of things, that's not much different, is it? There are biological factors that make it possible for a person to be able to sit up. Now, of course, there are things that could interfere with it. So there are going to be individual differences, right? But typically we're talking about these shared age-graded changes being those kinds of things that are mostly governed by biological factors. Puberty is another good example, right? That we all, on average, somewhere around age 12 for girls-ish, 14 for boys-ish, start to see signs that we're going through puberty. Some people much younger, some people much later, but on average, we can see a really, common age where a lot of people are around this age. These are things that are governed by the biological clock. And so we see that regardless of the culture in which you're reared, regardless of, social forces or factors, there's a pretty good guess that most people will have these events happen at about the same age. So we call these shared age-graded changes, where it's independent of especially things like cultural factors. Like you wouldn't see a significantly different number in the US than you would see in China, for example. You would see that this is pretty typical for human development. Shared age-graded changes that are nurture-based, we typically call this the social clock. Now, this is kind of a controversial subject these days. Some people say there is no such thing as a social clock anymore. A social clock is sort of a culturally based sort of set of expectations about what a person would be doing at different ages. I don't know why it's so controversial that there's a social clock, because there's clearly a social clock. I mean, it's culturally based. And so the social clock in one culture may be different from the social clock in another culture. And within a large culture like the United States, where we have, 330 million people, and we have just vast land masses where different regions have different, populations and things like that, you can imagine that the social clock can really vary, right? There's a lot of variation among different groups. But as a culture, we could look at this drawing that somebody made here that I've got on the slide, where you've got, you're a baby and haven't started school yet. Then you have the school years. Then you have, when you get to start driving. Then you have when you graduate from high school. Then sometime after that, the social culture expects you to get married. And then sometime after that to have a baby, to establish yourself in your career, then retire. I mean, this is a big, just broad basis of like kind of the trajectory that people expect for life. And, if you're a person who has violated the social clock, you can probably attest even more to the existence of the social clock. If you had a baby before you got married or before you graduated high school, for example, if you never got to start driving before you graduated high school, if you violated those norms for some reason, you're probably aware that you hear things from people. And that's part of how the social clock functions, is that the people around you say, wait, you're not even driving yet? Or, oh, look, you had a baby before you got married, or you had a baby before you graduated high school. Other people may be like, oh, yeah, looking askance at you because, you did something out of order. And you may feel like that. Maybe nobody even said something to you, but you may have felt like people were probably thinking that, which really underscores the existence of a social clock. The fact that we feel like other people might judge us if we're doing things out of order or at the wrong age or something like that. So I think there really is still at least a perception that a social clock exists. Maybe there are no like repercussions per se for violating the social clock, but I think there never really was. The social clock is imposed by the people around us. And so, you start dating somebody and pretty soon you're asked, are you guys going to get married? And then once you do get married, pretty soon you're asked, are you guys going to be having kids? I mean, like this is what people do. This is how it goes. So I personally, you're going to find in this class that I do talk about a social clock. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And I don't know why exactly we're pretending like it doesn't exist anymore. What I just really, before I move slides, I want to just emphasize that because a social clock exists doesn't mean that a social clock should exist. I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying that it is there. And that, if you happen to be in a condition of any of these things where you're violating the social clock, it's hard to not internalize some of the pressure that you feel from the people around you. But I would just like to urge you to cast off the tyranny of the shoulds, right? Shouldn't you be married before you have a baby? You know what? No, apparently not. So it is what it is. Don't impose a social clock on me when clearly, I'm not following it. So we don't have to go along with it. I'm just saying that it does exist and that we do probably feel that pressure. Now, another category of age-related change would be the cultural and cohort effects. So in this picture, I'm trying to illustrate that there are lots of different cultures around the world and that each culture has its own set of norms and expectations, social clocks, things like experiences that can affect development. And so cultural effects are going to be something that we talk about a lot in class, that different cultures adopt different strategies for parenting or a variety of things like that. And then the other thing is cohort effects. And we're going to talk about this a lot. I found a really complex picture that I love. It might be super confusing to you guys for, your first introduction to the concept of a cohort. But a cohort is a group of people who were born roughly around the same time. So we have, for example, at the very bottom, the lost generation that was born between 1883 and 1900. Next up is the greatest generation. They were the ones who were of age to serve in World War II. And then the next one is the silent generation, which is the group that sort of got ignored between the ones who went to war and then the babies that they made when they came home, which is what we call the baby boomers. It's called the baby boomers because those GIs came home and made a lot of babies when they got back. So from 1946 to 1964, a lot of babies were born. Then there was another, what I would like to call a silent generation, which I belong to, called Generation X. And it was a very small generation, just like the silent generation had been. And it's probably unsurprising to hear that Gen X is by and large the offspring of the silent generation. And so, the silent generation being a smaller generation produced a smaller generation called Generation X. And then the boomers made the millennials on average. And so between 1981 and 1996, we experienced another really big baby boom. They were called Generation Y for a little while they were trying to figure out what a good name would be to characterize the generation. And then they realized millennials would be a good thing to call them because, they were really affected by the turn of the century and things like that. Then the next age group, they started off calling them Gen Z because, again, it was a placeholder. They weren't sure what to ultimately name them. Then they started calling them Zoomers. And that's really funny that they called them Zoomers because they were not talking about what we all now know as Zoom. They were talking about, just having access to the internet and having, they called them digital natives, stuff like that. And they started calling them Zoomers. And then after COVID hit, suddenly we all know what Zoom is. So that they may have to change that generation's name again. I don't know, because now it's like trademarked. But so Generation Z is born 1997 to 2012. And then Generation Alpha, again, a placeholder because they're not exactly sure how they're going to ultimately characterize the generation that was born in the early 2010s. Through about the mid 2020s. And so the Generation Alpha is probably largely going to be the offspring of the millennials. And so Generation Alpha should theoretically be a bigger generation than the Generation Z. So we'll see if that actually pans out. That should be how it works out, that's a larger generation. So anyway, what we're really interested in psychology with regard to cohort effects is the possibility that Some of the developmental changes that we see, especially if we make comparisons between, let's say, a person who today is 12 years old and a person who today is, 32 years old, to what degree are those differences due to developmental changes, and to what degree are those differences due to cohort effects? The way that they were raised, or important events that happened, or their experience with the internet, or digital devices, or other kinds of things, right? Like, to what extent is it development, and to what extent is it stuff that this particular group happened to have experienced? So we're going to talk about that a lot in class. The third category of age-related change would be the unique non-shared events. So these would be things that happen to an individual. Like the critical period refers to a unique non-shared event that might happen to an individual that might interfere with their normal development. So here we have a little girl whose eye got injured, and so she's having to cover her eye for some reason. Is this going to be, if it occurred during a critical period and we kept her eye covered, would it actually impact her vision for the rest of her life, right? If it happens during a critical period, it might. So this would be something that's unique that happened to her. It's not about development. It's not about being part of a particular culture or cohort. It's about something happening specifically that might affect her individual development. A sensitive period is similar, except for this is where we're not sure that the event might have an impact on development. The presence or absence of the event may or may not affect development. So there are some sensitive periods during, the preschool years, for example, when the brain is really developing really fast between birth and 4 years old, that if some kind of toxin was present, or if there was inadequate nutrition or inadequate social interaction, it might have an impact on the developing brain. It's not a guarantee like in a critical period. It's a possibility that it would have an impact. And so these are the kinds of things we're talking about with unique non-shared events, things that might happen in a critical period and then have an effect, or something that might happen during a sensitive period that might have an effect. A really common example of a unique non-shared event that developmentalists have been interested in for decades is the impact of divorce of your parents when you're different ages. So is divorce more harmful during specific times? Like are some times more critical or more sensitive to divorce than other times? And different research has actually very confidently named very different ages as the critical times. But that's a good example of the kind of things that developmentalists are interested in, that specific things that might have happened to a really hot topic these days is a term called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And the idea is that if an adverse childhood experience or a group of adverse childhood experiences occurs during a critical or very sensitive period, may it have an impact lifelong on this person, as a function of having had that experience. I just want to warn you guys, terms like ACEs have gotten really popular for people to talk about as if they know what it means. Also, trauma has become a word that people are using a lot as if they know what it means. Not all distressing events are trauma. Not all distressing events are adverse childhood events. Adverse childhood experiences are big traumas. They are what in psychology we would call traumas. Things like the death of a parent, a significant illness in the child that maybe even was life-threatening, childhood sexual abuse or childhood physical abuse, malnutrition, like really big things. Divorce of parents isn't even necessarily an adverse childhood experience, because it may actually be a benefit for the child if the household had been full of stress and turmoil. Then the divorce might actually be a benefit. And so divorce is not technically an adverse childhood experience because it isn't always a negative. So it's really important, I think, if you're going to go through psychology classes, for you to come out of them knowing what the words actually mean in a psychological context, and not in a TikTok comment context, or I Googled it on the internet and I found this blog post about it. Like, we use trauma to mean something very specific, and adverse childhood events would be traumatic events. All right, so hopefully I gave you a good warning on that. All right, let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk a little bit about research design.